In this episode, we covered the Latin American drug trade. It is a serious problem that has negative economic, political, and security impacts on the people who live in the region. I was lucky to get to speak to an expert on this topic, Professor Nathaniel Mars from UCL. Here are some of the topics you can expect to hear about. The origins of the drug trade and why it has grown. How different groups are affected by the trade. News versus reality with regards to this topic. And what organizations or governments are doing to help. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let's get on with the first question. How did the drug trade start? Why has it been so successful? Why has it grown so much?
Well, to be honest, it's a long story, but the origins of, I guess, what we know as kind of the drug trade in Mexico today, leaving aside indigenous peoples' sort of production of and use and gathering of sort of sacramental psychoactive substances like peyote and kind of psilocybin mushrooms, but like sort of the drug trade implying production for profit and trafficking for sort of commercial purposes, I guess sort of really kicks off in the early part of the 20th century with some limited sowing and harvesting of opium poppy, and equally some sort of quite low level, local scale marijuana production. And almost sort of at the same time as the Mexican state, for various reasons, tries to tighten up its laws regarding the production of these substances in line with contemporary sort of fears about degeneration and ideas sort of rooted in eugenics, that the use of psychoactive substances is going to somehow negatively impact the sort of evolution of Mexico as a country towards sort of being more developed and modern. Drugs, loosely defined, including alcohol in many cases, are going to hold Mexico back. There is more enforcement and, well, prohibition is kind of brought in of these substances, and there is attempts at enforcing this kind of prohibition, which creates a black market, which makes the production of these substances and the trafficking of them much more profitable. And so by the 1930s, in western, sort of northwestern Mexico, Sinaloa, Sonora, sort of up in the mountains of the Sierra Madre Occidental, some peasant farmers begin to grow opium poppy on a sort of commercial scale. Similarly, in Sonora, there are some marijuana plantations where, again, mainly small farmers are producing and then selling on to local merchants who kind of pass these substances up the chain until they reach sort of professional traffickers who then try and take these things across the border to the US, where there is a guaranteed market for them, and a market that revolves around the dollar rather than the peso. It's kind of inherently more profitable. And that operates with the protection of certain officials, policemen, local politicians, even a few national level politicians. And by the sort of late 1940s, the Second World War has disrupted the flow of pharmaceuticals and illicit drugs as well, on a global scale, in a way that means for the US at least, which is the biggest market for drugs in the world, Mexico emerges as a very convenient kind of producing kind of nation for that US drug market. And that's when the drug trade in Mexico really becomes a big deal.
Just as I was listening, I noticed how nice your decor is.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got lots of bits and pieces from travels and field work, mainly in Mexico, up on the walls. Yeah, makes it feel like a little corner of Mexico's collection here and there.
So I know you've done quite a bit of research around this, but how does the drug trade impact local communities, especially vulnerable people like Indigenous people and children?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's often something that is kind of missed out on in discussions around the drug trade, which is often focused on, spectacular drug busts and the sort of assassinations of leading capos and, police officers as well, and kind of ambushes and all of this spectacular and frequently very violent stuff. I mean, there is a world of poor peasant sort of level farmers in Mexico who for much of the 20th century have been growing small amounts of marijuana, of poppies, as kind of cash crops alongside their licit crops in response to the pressures of the marketplace. And in most cases, that traffic, that low level kind of production and sort of the first rungs of the trafficking, literally some peasants selling what they've made to a local merchant. From there, it sort of gets passed up the chain. But that never used to be particularly violent. Obviously, to an extent, in the revolutionary and post-revolutionary years, the Mexican countryside, there was a certain level of endemic violence related to conflicts between families and sort of blood feuds and conflicts over land and water. But yeah, the drug trade was not inherently violent. It only really becomes violent when armed representatives of the state burst in on a village, all guns blazing. And at that point, sort of the stakes are raised and things, frequently spiral out of control, and you get sort of cycles of violence that emerge. But yeah, for the most part, the small scale growing of opium and marijuana has functioned much like the small scale growing of corn and beans and squash and other kind of traditional crops. Especially in really recent years, with the spread of sort of drug trade related violence throughout Mexico, the dangers involved in growing these illicit crops has grown. And that means that some of the profits, fairly small profits, from taking part in this inherently now dangerous trade, get invested in weapons and other sort of paying people bribes and other kind of investments in sort of self-protection, which often actually in the long term makes problems of violence worse. Similarly, in the last couple of years, really talking about since sort of 2017, 18. There has been a growth in the amount of synthetic opiates, such as fentanyl, that are being shipped either directly from China to the US, or the precursors shipped to Mexico, made into, in urban areas, these synthetic opiates, and then sort of taken north, which has cut into the amount of demand for organic opiates, stuff made from opium poppy. So there's been a sort of decline in demand, and therefore in price, of old school heroin in the Mexican countryside. That's had quite a severe impact on a lot of peasant farmers who previously made most of their sort of cash income from participation in this trade. And that, I think, more than anything, has really impacted communities in Nayarit, in parts of Jalisco, not as much necessarily in Sinaloa and Durango and Chihuahua, or actually it seems in Guerrero, where the price has come back up recently, probably for reasons tied to the pandemic, though we're not exactly sure what's going on there. But there are certain kind of areas of the country where people have lost a huge amount of their income. And their response has been either to migrate from those rural areas to cities in search of paid work, on the sort of the urban peripheries, or to migrate to rural areas where poppy production remains profitable, where they work not as autonomous producers, but as kind of the paid labor force for cartels operating on a sort of more industrial scale. And that particularly impacts children who move with their families, either to the cities or to these kind of illicit camps in other kind of mountainous areas where opium is grown, and who miss out on schooling opportunities and the sort of relationships with other members of their family, particularly with the older generations, that were previously really key to social sort of structures, particularly in indigenous areas of Mexico. But yeah, the situation is very much in flux, and there are some areas that seemed to be really hard hit by the decline in the price of poppies, with all of the kind of social problems and kind of negative impacts on men and women and children and sort of family units that entailed, where the price has now gone back up, and these problems have not necessarily disappeared, and in many cases the price has gone up, but so have levels of violence, which is brings with it another set, obviously, of very severe problems. But yeah, everything's very much in flux at the moment. It could be quite hard to know exactly what's going on where. So yeah.
Okay. And so my next question is, I guess, a little bit related to what you were saying, that we don't really know what's happening really, but how different is news from reality with regards to this topic?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Mexico is undergoing a crisis of violence right now, and has been since at least 2006, although in many sort of drug producing areas, the crisis of violence actually goes back further, all the way to the sort of early to mid 1970s, when a major eradication operation under the auspices of the Mexican military, police forces, and with heavy US involvement called Operation Condor was launched. And so, these are areas like Badiraguato in Sinaloa that, you see frequently in the news. They appear in early episodes of season 1 of Narcos Mexico. And, it's safe to say that these are areas where violence goes back a long way, remains severe. That's reflected in homicide statistics, rates of domestic violence as well, and kidnappings and other kind of forms of violence. I think the news is inaccurate in that a very few of these different kind of municipalities are repeatedly depicted as kind of the complete heartland of drug trafficking, and as the only places really worthy of mention when it comes to these subjects. And the truth is that actually around 1/3 of Mexico's municipalities at last count were reported to have had at least sort of one plot of land dedicated to opium poppy production. So clearly, like, drug production is more widespread than we might assume in the news. It's not just limited to a handful of really like notorious bits of the country up in Sinaloa. It's more widespread than that. Similarly, the news isn't particularly accurate when anyone portrayed as, anyone reported as being involved in the drug trade is portrayed as being a kind of paid up, dangerous member of a cartel. It's way too simplistic. It's way too black and white. And the simple fact is that the vast majority of those who are involved in the drug trade are involved tangentially. They're people who make packed lunches for, their husbands who go off to work in the fields where there is some opium being grown, as well as a bunch of other stuff. They're taxi drivers who, transport the bags of travelers which have, drugs hidden inside. There is so many people who the drug trade kind of touches, and a huge amount of Mexico's economy is tied up in that. People who don't even really know that they are involved in the drug trade, and would far less ever kind of call themselves members of a trafficking organization or anything like that. Similarly, most of those who grow drugs are farmers. They're not narcos. They don't know very much about the cartels. I've had chats with people who, amongst other things, grow opium, who told me that eventually the kind of raw material that they supply is processed into cocaine for the gringos. They didn't even know that what they were producing was the raw material for heroin. That's the level of kind of ignorance about how the higher levels of the drug trade work. As far as they're concerned, they're just producing a raw material that happens to be worth quite a lot of money, and that means occasionally soldiers burst in and potentially beat them up and torture them or haul them off to jail, but it's kind of that or starve. So you do what you can to survive. And so the sort of very sensationalist tendencies of a lot of news reporting, where anyone caught growing opium must be some sort of dangerous narco, that really isn't very realistic at all. But the fact that Mexico is basically, in many parts of the country, experiencing something akin to a war, that I think is real enough, unfortunately.
And then, speaking of another war, is the war on drugs, because it has been going on for a long time, maybe not as long relative to other periods, but it has been going on for a long time. So is the war on drugs successful, or is it working better recently, or what has changed? What are they doing to stop this?
Well, I mean, I guess, yeah, the war, war on drugs, well, we can define it in a couple of different ways, but I think there is an argument for tracing the war on drugs all the way back to Richard Nixon's announcement of a literal war on drugs in the early 1970s, which would make it one of the longest running wars to be waged by the US or indeed any other country in the 20th century. So yeah, the idea of a war on drugs is not a new thing. Indeed, could argue that it goes back even further, and that in Latin America, at least, there has been a war on drugs waged by regional governments, backed, encouraged, in many cases pressured into it by various US agencies, all of which was sort of orchestrated by Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, from the 1950s onwards. So this is a very long-running conflict, which takes different shapes depending on where exactly we're talking about. And well, how do you measure the success of this conflict? It's a pretty deadly conflict. If we look at what is happening in Mexico currently as one facet of this war on drugs, given that the violence kind of really kicked off in 2006, when the Mexican government, backed by the US, declared war on the cartels and began trying to take out their leaders. The violence has spiked. Estimates vary, but there are at least kind of 300,000 deaths since 2006 that are linked to this sort of cartel state, inter-cartel, interstate conflict, which is very messy and isn't, again, a black and white thing where the state is just fighting against drug traffickers. There are all sorts of Mexican institutions and individuals at the top of those who have shown to be, they've been shown to be very involved in the trafficking as well as anything else. So, yeah, how do you define the success of this quite brutal conflict? I mean, it's not worked in terms of reducing the amount of narcotics entering the US. Year on year, the amount of drugs entering the US has gone up. It has not reduced the harms done by, drug overdoses in the US. Indeed, drug overdoses and deaths related to drugs have massively increased over the last 10 years. And indeed, I think there were around sort of 90,000 overdoses in the last sort of year and a bit. That's in many cases down to fentanyl, and the increasing amount of fentanyl in the US drug supply is a direct consequence of the war waged on peasant producers of heroin, which turns out to be less deadly than this synthetic stuff. So by that metric as well, the war on drugs has been a failure, because there are more drugs in the US, and the drugs that are in the US are more dangerous and more people are dying from them. If you add to that the fact that in Mexico, more physical territory than ever before is being dedicated to drug production, murder rates in many of these drug producing areas are extremely high. And indeed, the conflict between various different armed organizations, which have splintered into many, many more armed organizations as a consequence of the war on drug cartels, has spilled out into wider society. And it's not just drug trafficking organizations who are running around with guns in Mexico anymore. There are also hundreds of different autodefensas and policías comunitarias and other kind of armed self-defense or vigilante groups who, are kind of inherently challenging the idea of the state as the kind of sole legitimate arbiter of violence. So, I mean, just looking at those facts, I find it quite difficult to accept that the war on drugs has been anything other than a huge failure. I think that I would very confidently posit that drugs have won the war on drugs. I'm sure that there are a lot of, politicians and law enforcement agents who might argue differently. But, law enforcement tends to argue the case for a war on drugs because their budgets depend on it. And politicians tend to ignore the statistics and the actual facts and figures and focus on whipping up fear and kind of moral panics related to drugs, again, because it allows them to whip up support and get sort of positive headlines in the media. So I guess, the only real success in terms of this war on drugs that I can see has been in terms of boosting police and military budgets in the US and across Latin America, and getting a load of tough on crime type politicians elected or further cementing their power bases, but at the cost of how many lives?
Okay, and then my final question would be that this whole thing sounds like a very complex problem with, I'm sure not only one solution, but what kind of things are individuals doing, are local organizations doing, international organizations and governments doing to help, and how are they efficient and how are they not efficient?
Well, there are many organizations in the US and in Mexico and in other Latin American countries, civilian lobbying groups, medical patients associations, victims of sort of drug violence support networks, who are working to mitigate some of the harms of this conflict and of the prohibition of drugs, full stop, by lobbying for and backing and kind of pushing the introduction of decriminalization or even legalization of these substances that are clearly not going to just go away because we are sending guns and money to Latin American countries. And I think that sort of grassroots work that is being done to push for sort of meaningful changes in the law that will reduce harms by taking some of the black market profit motive out of the drug trade. They're doing an excellent job in terms of getting that kind of legislation at least into the kind of public discourse. And I mean, we're seeing right now in the US, at state level, at least, even though the federal government is being very slow and is very worried about potential blowback in terms of negative headlines and sort of tough on crime criticism. But at state level, there is a real push towards the decriminalization or legalization of drugs, which I think is a good thing and will only kind of reduce the total harms done by prohibition over the last 50 years. That you can see in Mexico as well, where various Supreme Court kind of cases brought by civilian groups have resulted in legal changes in terms of the sort of categorization of drugs. And this is leading to, slowly but surely, the kind of de facto liberalization of sort of the drug prohibition regime, and indeed the full-on legalization of the consumption, at least, of marijuana. So that's really positive. Similarly, people are marching against the war on drugs in Mexico, in Peru, in the streets of many US cities. There are campaigns against this violence and the problems that it causes that are not actually related to drugs per se. It's, violence begets violence. And the more, I think, support that can be mustered for these groups who are rightly calling out the war on drugs for what it is, an extremely expensive and destructive sham, the more support we can give them, the better.
That's something I actually didn't know, and that was really interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was so nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too.
Here's a quick recap. We learned about the actual drug trade, so how it works, how it started, and how the trade has grown. We also learned about how it is portrayed in the media and how different groups are affected by the drug trade. I felt most strongly about how farmers, families, and children are affected by the violence that goes on because of the trade. Dr. Mars talked about how most farmers who grow opium poppies or other plants used to make drugs are actually just trying to make a living and don't even know what their crops are used for. I'm also surprised by how long this problem has been going on for. It is a problem without a clear solution, because otherwise people would have figured it out years ago. I'm also shocked by how people trying to solve the problem actually create more problems for the locals, which makes solving the problem even more difficult. As he mentioned in the end, people protest against the war on drugs because it actually just adds another problem onto the problem. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. If you have any more information or thoughts about the topic, please leave it in the comments. I would also love to hear your suggestions about topics you would like me to cover.